He read the name on the certificate twice before he understood it. And when he understood it, the Duke of Ashcombe went down on one knee on the floor of his own library before a housemaid and did not rise for a long moment. Margaret Wren, 24, had polished that floor herself for the better part of 2 years. She knew the grain of the wood the way she knew the sound of his study door, the particular click that meant he was displeased, the softer give that meant he had merely forgotten she existed. She had not expected, on a wet Tuesday in the November of 1856, to watch him kneel before her with a paper trembling in his hand, and grief and fury both fighting for control of his face. What no one in that house yet understood was that Margaret had been born in the west wing of Ashcombe Park, in a room now used to store linen, 29 years before that Tuesday, and had been carried from it in secrecy before her first cry had properly faded from the air. She did not know this. Not yet. She knew only that she scrubbed floors for a man who rarely looked at her, in a house that had once, according to the older servants, belonged to a different family entirely, before the present Duke's father had acquired it through means the housekeeper only ever described with a tightening of her mouth. Margaret had come to Ashcombe Park at 22, 5 years after the death of the aunt who had raised her in a cottage outside Winchester, on the strength of a reference she now suspected had been arranged by someone who knew rather more about her than she did herself. She had needed work. The position had needed filling. She had not asked why a girl with her education, for she read Latin, and this was remarked upon and disapproved of by the housekeeper, should be scrubbing floors rather than teaching them. The Duke of Ashcombe was 33, tall in the manner that made low doorways a personal insult, and possessed of a coldness so total that the servants had taken privately to calling him the Marble Duke. He had not always been marble. There were those in the house old enough to remember a boy who had laughed once before his father, the previous Duke, dead now 11 years, had set about the long, patient work of freezing that laughter out of him, lesson by lesson, until warmth itself had come to seem, to the boy who became the man, a kind of weakness his father would have punished. He did not remember the boy. He remembered only the lessons. It would be many weeks before Margaret understood what those lessons had cost him, and longer still before she understood what they had cost her. The certificate that brought him to his knees had been found, that Tuesday morning, in a locked drawer of his late father's desk, during the tedious business of settling a decade-old dispute with a Hampshire solicitor over timber rights. The solicitor, a meticulous man named Pruitt, had required the original deed to the West Wing's construction, and, in producing it, the Duke's steward had disturbed a false bottom in the drawer beneath, and found there a birth register page, torn from the parish record at Ashcombe St. Mary, and a letter in his father's own hand. The register recorded the birth of one Margaret Ashcombe Wren, daughter of Henrietta, Duchess of Ashcombe, and the 5th Duke, born the 11th of March, 1827, in the west wing of Ashcombe Park. The letter explained, in his father's cold, exact hand, precisely why the child did not exist. The 5th Duke had wanted a son. He had received instead a daughter, from a wife who died within the hour of the birth. And rather than accept a daughter as his heir, rather than see the dukedom pass, failing a son, to the daughter's eventual husband, a man not of his choosing, he had done what cruel, exacting men of his kind sometimes did. He had paid a midwife for her silence. He had sent the child away, to a widow in Winchester, with instructions and an allowance. And he had married again within 2 years, and produced, at last, a son. That son was the man now kneeling on his library floor, with the register page in his hand, staring at a name he had scrubbed past every day for 2 years, without once reading it as anything but Wren, the housemaid, mind the great. He had called for her by instinct, before he had fully decided what he meant to say, and she had come in her apron, with coal dust still on her hands, and had stopped 3 feet inside the door, because a duke did not kneel, not for anyone, and certainly not for her. "Your Grace," She said it carefully, the way one spoke to a man who might, for all she knew, be taken suddenly and dangerously ill. "Shall I fetch someone?" "I am not ill," he said, and his voice had none of its customary iron in it. "Margaret, sit down." No one had asked her to sit in that house in 2 years. She sat because the alternative was to remain standing while a duke knelt, which seemed the greater impropriety of the two. He did not rise. He held out the register page instead, across the space between them, and watched her face while she read it. And she would remember for the rest of her life the particular quality of his attention in that moment. Not the cold, assessing watchfulness she had grown used to from a distance, but something rawer, something that looked almost like fear. She read her own name. She read the date. She read the words Duchess of Ashcombe beside a name, Henrietta, that meant nothing to her, that had never once been spoken in the cottage outside Winchester, where her aunt, dying, had told her only that her mother had loved her and could not keep her, and had wept when Margaret pressed for more, and so Margaret, who did not like to cause weeping, had stopped asking. "This is a mistake," she said. "There must be another Margaret Wren." "There is not." He said it the way he said everything, flatly, as a fact requiring no defense. But something beneath the flatness was breaking. "You were born in this house, in the West Wing, in the room your predecessor used for linen storage, because my father converted the nursery the week after you left it, so that no one would ever ask why a nursery stood empty in a house that wanted an heir." Had anyone been watching closely, they might have seen in that instant the precise moment a housemaid's entire understanding of her own life began to come apart at the seams, and had to be, very quietly, rebuilt. She did not weep. She did not cry out. She did not demand, as a lesser woman might have, immediate satisfaction of every question crowding her mind at once. She asked instead, in a voice that surprised them both with its steadiness, "Why does this concern your grace so urgently that he kneels?" It was, she would later think, the exact question that undid him, because it was the question a servant asked, and not the question a sister asked. And the gap between those two questions was the whole of what his father's cruelty had cost them both. "Because," he said, "if this register is accurate, and my father's letter confirms that it is, then you are my father's eldest legitimate child. You are my elder sister. And under the entail governing this dukedom, which passes, in default of a son, to the eldest daughter before any subsequent son of a second marriage, you, Margaret, are the rightful Duchess of Ashcombe in your own right, and I am not the Duke at all. I never was." The silence that followed had weight. It had texture. Margaret would remember the smell of it for the rest of her life. Beeswax polish from the floor she had waxed that morning, and the cold, waxen scent of the candles burning low in their sconces, though it was not yet noon, because November light did not reach far into that library, and he had not thought, in the shock of the discovery, to ring for more. "I do not want it," she said at last. "That," he said, "is not entirely for either of us to decide." The turning point of this story is not the moment he knelt. It is what came after. The 11 weeks that followed, in which a duke who had never once been undone by anything set himself, with the same iron discipline his father had beaten into him for other purposes, to the task of undoing his father's crime. And in the doing of it, discovered that the sister he had wronged without knowing it was the only person alive who had ever looked at him and seen, beneath the marble, a man rather than a title. Word could not be contained in a house of 30 servants for more than a day, and by the second morning, Margaret Wren, the housemaid, had become, in the hushed and electrified conversation of the below-stairs kitchen, Lady Margaret, though no one dared say it to her face, and the housekeeper, who had once disapproved of her Latin, now curtsied to her in the corridor and did not know where to put her eyes. Margaret found the curtsying unbearable. She said so, once, to the only person in the house who seemed to understand why. "They think I have become someone else," she told him on the fourth evening in the same library where he had taken to finding her because she was, he discovered, the only person whose company did not require him to perform the Duke. "I have not. I have only learned who I was before I was told to forget it." "You were never told to forget it," he said. "You were never told at all. That is the difference, and it is not a small one." He was 33 and had spent every year since the age of 9 learning that affection was a lever other people used against him, that warmth invited exploitation, that his father's love, such as it was, had been withheld like a payment contingent on performance, and Margaret watched him say true, unguarded things to her across that library table, with the visible effort of a man lifting a weight he had not tested in 20 years. She did not press him. She had learned patience in a cottage outside Winchester, and had it reinforced by 2 years of scrubbing floors for people who did not see her. And patience, she found, was not merely a discipline for enduring what could not be helped. It was a discipline that let her see, clearly, a man other people had given up trying to reach. "You could dispute the register," she said on the 6th day. "Burn the letter. No one else has seen it. You would remain Duke, and I would remain whatever I have always been." She watched him consider it, and watched him reject it, and understood, in the considering, something about him that the below-stairs gossip had entirely missed. That his coldness was not cruelty. It was armor, built by a cruel man, worn so long the wearer had forgotten there was a face beneath it. "I considered it," he said, with the honesty that had become, without either of them quite naming it, the currency between them. "For perhaps 4 minutes on the first night, I considered it. Then I imagined living the rest of my life knowing what I had done, and found that dupedom was not worth what it would cost me to keep it that way." It was the closest either of them had come, in 6 days, to speaking of what neither of them was yet prepared to call by its true name. Elsewhere in the county, the news travelled faster and less kindly. Mr. Josiah Trask, the family's long-time trustee and the man who had managed the Ashcombe estates and investments since the 5th Duke's death, arrived on the 8th day uninvited and unannounced, and it became clear within the hour that he had a considerable interest in Margaret Wren remaining, forever, a housemaid. Trask had spent 11 years quietly diverting estate income through investments of his own devising, certain that a young duke, too absorbed in grief and duty to examine his own ledgers, would never look closely enough to catch him. And a change of succession, an inquiry into the estate's true condition by a new duchess with, as it happened, a ledger-sharp mind of her own, threatened to expose the whole of it. "This register," Trask said, standing in the library with his hat in his hands and an unconvincing smile fixed to his face, "is a curiosity, Your Grace, nothing more. Parish records are notoriously unreliable. I should advise strongly against any hasty action that might unsettle the estate, or the girl's own situation, which I am sure she finds comfortable enough as it stands." "The girl," Margaret said, from the window seat where she had been reading, and where Trask, evidently, had not expected her to be present, "is in the room, Mr. Trask, and finds her situation a great deal less comfortable than you imagine, though not for the reasons you suppose." Trask's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes did, and it was the Duke. She still thought of him, privately, as the Duke, though the word had become a complicated one between them. Who noticed it first? Because reading the falseness beneath a composed face was a skill his father's household had trained into him early and thoroughly, if for uglier purposes than the one he now put it to. "You will forgive me, Trask," he said, "if I ask my own solicitor to review the estate accounts personally before any further decisions are made. A formality only. I am certain you have nothing to fear from it." The threat, delivered in that flat, iron voice, needed no further ornament, and Trask's departure that afternoon was considerably less composed than his arrival. But the season was not yet finished with either of them, for Trask did not retreat quietly. he retreated to plan, and what he planned over the following days was the swiftest and most efficient means of ensuring that Margaret Wren never lived long enough or remained credible enough to inherit anything at all. It began with whispers, a word here to a magistrate's clerk, about the unreliability of parish registers and the ease with which a clever servant might forge one, given access to the muniment room and sufficient motive. A word there to a gossiping cousin, about the housemaid's suspicious education, her too convenient arrival 5 years prior, the strange coincidence of her name. By the 10th day, a rumour had begun circulating in the nearest town that the girl at Ashcombe Park was no long-lost daughter at all, but an adventuress, possibly in league with a forger, who had somehow gained the young Duke's confidence and meant to swindle him out of the dukedom entirely. Margaret heard the rumour from the housekeeper, who heard it from the greengrocer's wife, and she received it with the same quiet steadiness with which she had received the register page 11 days before. "They will say I invented my own birth," she said, "to steal a title I did not know existed a fortnight ago." "They will say a great many things," the Duke said, "and every one of them will be answered." How? With the truth, delivered so thoroughly and so publicly that no one will have the courage to repeat the lie a second time. It was, she thought, the first time in her life anyone had offered to fight for her name, rather than merely explain, gently, why it was easier not to. The evidence, when it came quietly, and not from the direction either of them expected. Among the papers in the force-bottom drawer, beneath the birth register and the 5th Duke's letter, Pruitt the solicitor discovered a second item, overlooked in the first shock of discovery. A sealed letter in a woman's hand, addressed to no one, dated the day of Margaret's birth, and evidently written by the dying Duchess herself in the last hours of her life, entrusted to a midwife who had, it seemed, kept faith with the promise for 29 years, rather than destroy it, as she had been paid to do. The letter was brief. It asked, in a hand grown weak, that whoever found it should know that the child had been wanted, had been loved in the brief hour her mother held her, and that if fate ever returned her to Ashcombe Park, she should be told this above all, that she had cost her mother nothing, and been worth everything. Margaret read it once, alone, in the room that had been a nursery and then a linen closet, and would now, it seemed, be a nursery again. And she did not weep for the mother she could not remember, so much as for the 2 years she had spent in that house, not knowing a woman had loved her enough to write such a thing with her last strength. She brought the letter to the Duke that evening, not as ammunition against Trask's rumours, though it would serve as that, but because she found, without entirely deciding to, that she wanted him to be the first person she showed it to. He read it in silence. When he looked up, his composure, the composure that had survived a father's cruelty, a title's weight, and 11 days of upended succession without visible crack, was entirely gone. "She wrote this for you," he said, "and my father destroyed her for it, buried her memory the same as he buried yours." "He did not destroy me," Margaret said. "He delayed me. There is a difference, and I find I am only now able to see it." She had not intended the words as forgiveness of him, of the Duke before her, who bore his father's guilt by inheritance rather than deed, but he received them as something adjacent to it, and it was in that moment, with the letter open between them and the last of the daylight failing outside the library windows, that he said the thing he had been circling for 11 days, without permitting himself to land on it. "I do not want the title back, Margaret, if the cost of keeping it is losing what has grown between us this fortnight. I would rather be your steward than a stranger duke to a stranger sister who was cheated of her name." "We are not strangers," she said. "We have never, I think, been strangers. We were only both taught, by the same cruel man in different ways, to hide who we were." It was the closest thing to a declaration either of them had made, and it hung between them, weighted and unfinished, because there remained the small matter of Trask and the rumour, and a county that had not yet been told the truth. In the days between the sealed letter and the public reckoning, the household at Ashcombe Park settled into a strange, suspended rhythm. Neither the house it had been, nor the house it would become. Margaret still rose before dawn from habit, dressed in the plain grey she had worn for 2 years, and stood for a full minute each morning at the door of what had been her small room in the servants' passage, uncertain whether she was permitted to remain there or obliged to move to the rooms Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, kept insisting she must now occupy in the family wing. "I have scrubbed that floor 100 times, Margaret told her, on the 12th morning, gesturing to the corridor beyond the door. "I do not think I shall forget how, merely because a register says I need not." "No, my lady," Mrs. Fenwick said, and then flushed deeply, because she had not intended the title to slip out so easily, and Margaret only smiled, a small, private thing, and did not correct her. It was in this suspended fortnight that she and the Duke, she had begun privately to think of him as Edmund, though she had not yet permitted herself to say it aloud, fell into the habit of the library in the evenings, a habit neither of them named, but both of them kept with a consistency that would have alarmed either of them a month before. He would read estate correspondence at the great desk his father had once occupied. She would sit in the window seat with a book she rarely finished, watching the last light fail over the yew avenue, and the silence between them had none of the brittleness silence had once carried in that house. "You are not reading," he observed one such evening without looking up. "I'm thinking that a month ago you would not have noticed whether I read or not." "A month ago?" he said. "I did not know how to notice anything that was not a ledger or a duty. I find the education inconvenient. I recommend you cease providing it." It was the driest joke she had heard him make, and she laughed, an unguarded, surprised sound that made him look up at last. And something in his face, seeing her laugh, arrested itself there for a long moment, before he returned, with visible effort, to the correspondence in front of him. Trask's retreat from the house after his first confrontation with Margaret and Pruitt's threatened review was not the end of his campaign, but its opening move, and the following days brought a slow accumulation of small cruelties dressed as concern. A note arrived from Mrs. Fenwick, unsigned, suggesting she examine the household silver, as such things had been known to go missing when servants were elevated above their proper station. A caller from the county, a Mrs. Ainsworth, whose husband held land adjoining the Ashcombe boundary and owed Trask a private debt of gratitude Margaret would only later learn the particulars of, arrived under pretense of welcome and spent the visit asking pointed questions about Margaret's education, her years in Winchester, the exact circumstances of the aunt who had raised her, questions calibrated less to satisfy curiosity than to plant doubt. Margaret answered every question with the same composed patience she had spent 2 years perfecting in service, offering nothing that could be twisted and betraying nothing of the unease the visit cost her. And it was only after Mrs. Ainsworth had gone that the Duke, who had observed the whole exchange from the doorway without announcing himself, crossed the room and said, "Lo, you need not endure that alone. I would have sent her away the moment she overstepped." "I did not need you to send her away," Margaret said. "I needed only to be believed when I told you of it afterward. And I find, to my own surprise, that I trust you to believe me." It was not yet a declaration, but it was close enough to one. But neither of them spoke again for the length of a full minute, and the fire in the grate, built high against the November chill, seemed to both of them to burn a fraction warmer than it had a moment before. The whispers in the town, when they came exactly as Margaret had feared, and the Duke had promised to answer. A slow accretion of doubt, disguised as reasonable caution, growing louder with each retelling, until by the 10th day, a version of the story circulated in which Margaret had not merely claimed a false inheritance, but had, in the more inventive tellings, forged the register with her own hand, using skills learned from a disreputable uncle no one could name or locate. The Duke heard this particular version from his own valet, who had heard it from a stable boy, who had heard it from the very greengrocer's wife who had first carried the rumour to Mrs. Fenwick. And he received it with a stillness that Margaret, watching him across the library that evening, recognized as fury, more dangerous for being so completely controlled. "They will not stop repeating it," he said, "until they are given something more compelling to repeat instead." "And what is more compelling than a scandal, Your Grace?" "The truth, delivered with enough force that repeating the lie becomes an embarrassment rather than entertainment. I intend to give them that. I ask only that you trust me to choose the moment." She did trust him, she realized. Turning the thought over with the same careful patience, she turned over every unfamiliar fact. And the realization itself was a small vindication, a private one, that owed nothing to registers or entails. That somewhere in the space of 3 weeks, without either of them quite marking the day it happened, she had come to trust a Duke of Ashcombe with something more than her safety. She had come to trust him with the truth of who she was, unpolished and unproven, before the county had been given any reason to believe it themselves. The public reckoning came 3 weeks later, at a gathering the Duke convened at Ashcombe Park under the pretense of a harvest occasion, but which every soul in the county understood, by the time the invitations arrived, to be something considerably more consequential. Pruitt, the solicitor, had, by then, completed his review of Trask's accounts and found the diversions the trustee had spent 11 years concealing, a discrepancy running to several £1,000s, meticulously hidden and meticulously, at last, uncovered. Trask arrived at the gathering, expecting to continue his campaign of doubt. He left it in the custody of the county magistrate, exposed before the very society he had hoped to turn against Margaret, his own fraud laid bare in the same hour as her legitimacy, so that the rumor he had spent weeks cultivating collapsed under the weight of the truth he had been using it to hide. The Duke, though it was already becoming difficult even for the servants to think of him by that title, when Margaret's claim stood confirmed by register, letter, and law alike, stood before the assembled county that evening and said, in the flat, exact voice that had once been his armor and had become, over the preceding weeks, simply his voice, that his sister was the rightful Duchess of Ashcombe, that he had known it for 3 weeks and would have known it sooner had his father possessed a fraction of her honesty, and that any person in the room who wished to continue questioning her legitimacy was welcome to direct their questions to the magistrate currently holding Mr. Trask's account books. No one asked any further questions that evening. Margaret did not immediately claim the title in full. She had spent 29 years without it, and found she was in no hurry to be transformed, overnight, into a woman she did not yet recognize. What she claimed instead, over the weeks that followed, was something quieter, and to her mind, considerably more valuable. The running of the estate, at which her ledger-sharp mind and years of unacknowledged competence proved a considerably better steward than either her father or her half-brother had ever been forced to become. The restoration of her mother's memory, whose portrait she had removed from a storeroom and hung, at last, in the gallery where a Duchess of Ashcombe ought to hang. And the slow, patient, unhurried construction of something with her brother that was not quite Duke and Duchess, not quite sister and brother, but something rebuilt from the wreckage their father had left them, brick by brick, on terms they set for themselves. He asked her, eventually, not with the formality of a proposal she had ever once expected from anyone, given that she had believed herself destined for a housemaid's quiet spinsterhood, but with the same flat, exact honesty he had offered her since the day he knelt on the library floor. Whether she intended to marry, now that her name and fortune were restored to her, and if she did, whether she might permit him to remain close enough in her life to still call himself family, whatever legal fiction the entail might eventually require them to construct around the awkward reality of a dukedom with 2 claimants who had by then become inseparable. "I have no intention of marrying a stranger for a title I already possess," she told him, with the dry composure that had become, between them, its own kind of tenderness. "And you, Your Grace, ceased to be a stranger some weeks ago." What followed would not be spoken of in the county's polite circles for a generation. The peculiar arrangement by which the Ashcombe dukedom came, eventually, to be held by a duchess in her own right, who ran the estate with a competence her father had never believed a daughter capable of, and a brother who remained, by her own insistence and his own quiet gratitude, master of Ashcombe in every practical sense but name. The two of them presiding over a household that had once been divided by a dead man's cruelty, and was now, by the account of every servant who remembered both eras, the warmest it had been in 40 years. The estate itself changed slowly, in the manner of things built to last rather than to impress. Margaret took to walking the tenant farms herself, in the autumn following her restoration, with a ledger under her arm and a patience for complaint that her father had never once extended to a soul who worked his land. And within a year, the rents that had gone uncollected under Trask's careless stewardship were collected fairly, and the cottages that had gone unrepaired were repaired, and the tenants who had once eyed the great house with the wary resentment of the long neglected began, cautiously, to speak of the new mistress of Ashcombe with something closer to affection than fear. Edmund, for she called him Edmund now, freely in private, though the county still addressed him by whatever fraction of his old title custom permitted a duke's brother to retain, found, in the months that followed, that the coldness he had worn since boyhood had not vanished so much as gone into a kind of honourable retirement, called upon only when the estate's business genuinely required it, and never again turned upon the one person who had taught him it was possible to set it down. He watched Margaret manage a difficult tenant, or face down a sceptical banker, or sit for an hour with Mrs. Fenwick going over household accounts with a thoroughness his father would have found unbecoming in a daughter, and found each instance added something to a ledger of his own, not of debts, but of a slow, accumulating certainty that the family his father had tried to erase had, against every design of that cruel and exacting man, produced something worth keeping after all. They did not marry, for the law recognized them as siblings, and no earthly persuasion would alter that fact. But the household that grew up around them in the years that followed bore every mark of a partnership as complete as any the county's more conventional unions could claim. Margaret oversaw the estate's accounts and its tenants. Edmund oversaw its correspondence and its politics, content, as he had told her honestly in that first suspended fortnight, to be her steward in every practical sense, while she held the name their father had denied her. Visitors to Ashcombe Park in later years remarked, without quite knowing how to phrase it politely, on the peculiar warmth of a household that ought, by every rule of inheritance and grievance, to have been divided, and was instead the closest thing either of them had ever known to whole. Margaret hung the letter from her mother in a frame beside the restored portrait, where any visitor to the gallery might read, if they paused long enough, the words a dying woman had trusted to a midwife's decades of silence. She had cost her mother nothing, and been worth everything. It was, Margaret thought, whenever she passed it, not a bad epitaph for a woman who had spent 2 years believing herself invisible, and had discovered, in the space of a single wet November, that she had never been invisible at all, only unread, like a name on a page no one had thought to open. Years later, when a niece asked her why the portrait gallery held 2 Duchesses of Ashcombe hung side by side, mother and daughter, separated by 9 and 20 years, and a cruelty neither of them had chosen, Margaret would tell her only that some inheritances could not be stolen, no matter how long they were hidden, and that the house had simply been waiting, all that time, for someone patient enough to read what had been written, and stay, and stay.